Brexit, a lesson the EU has failed to learn. Despite much ado about Brexit, we have failed to look beyond the pangs of emotions into why Britain left and how to preempt future exits. Both the EU and the UK should share the responsibility, but this statement of the obvious does little help. Britain's leave has pushed to the fore existential questions of what went wrong in the EU and why countries might continue to feel underrepresented or led into a direction another pace non-compliant with their national interests. While some of the United Kingdom's motives are too specific to be replicated by other countries, such as nostalgia over imperial past, global role and nuclear status, seat at the Security Council of the United Nations, etc. But most of the Brexit undercurrents have an EU origin. Such flagrant disregard warrants future shocks and possible exits. There is growing evidence that the averages in balancing national interests at the EU level generate policy mainstreams that are neither optimal nor sustainable. There are major flaws and barriers to competition within the EU at the expense of national interests. A recent point in the case is when France stepped in and initiated EU legislation restricting competition in the EU transport sector from more efficient CEE companies in order to protect the interests of French transport companies. The result is a less competitive EU transport sector and a greater competition from transport companies in non-EU countries. The EU has opted to tax global EU's digital leaders instead of helping EU equivalents grow and compete. Market protection, when there is no EU analogues, leads to market degeneration and a loss of competitiveness. What is good for one country is not necessarily fit for another, but best case practices do not rest with the bigger states. Yet larger countries have disproportionately larger weight and access to EU resources and often choose to fund national favorites at the expense of EU best entrepreneurs. Climate change policies are a good lead into what went wrong, although not precisely the case why Britain has left, but an indicator of why more and why new member states might choose to look for exit. Although transition speed and content of the climate change policies have been left to national discretion, the stick and the punishments for the non-compliance rests at EU level, limiting the space between EU and national disruptive and adaptive policies. The climate change policies in general, and the Green Deal in particular, miss a detailed and comprehensive impact and risk analysis at a national level. It is likely that once imposed from the top, these policies would generate anti-EU sentiments and stimulate exiteers into action. The notion that only big countries like Britain can leave defies common sense. Geographical proximity is a definite prerequisite for solidarity and joint action that justify different union formats. Still, there are enough instances in Europe of prosperous states that are not members of the EU. Henceforth, EU membership is a secondary factor to adequate, visionary and globally competitive public governance. To rule out that countries will, by default, be lost without the EU is a gross exaggeration. Many in the EU chose to consider Britain insane and doomed just because it had opted out of the EU. Why should Britain fail when Norway and Switzerland have succeeded? Why not listen to the grievances of the half-hearted Brexiteers among the British people who have voted for the British Conservatives despite most opinioned sympathies for the EU? What changed their mind in the last minute? How would a British taxpayer feel when across the continent oligarchs abuse their money in EU funds and no one seems to care? There is a profound detachment between national EU-level policies. The Green Deal was conceived and forced upon EU members from the top without even bothering to ask the national government whether a 50% reduction by 2030 is doable and at what price. whether the value of associated destruction will not outweigh the benefits and undermine living standards, national security, and existential demographics. Britain felt isolated in the Franco-German attempt to decide in tandem what is good or bad for the EU. And true, Britain was too big to be ignored and to accept without humility the outcome of preordained decision-making process at the EU level. The prospect of more power going to France and Germany at the expense of balanced decisions scare many member states. If Great Britain has chosen to leave, sending the message that it has given up hope of influencing change from within the EU, worth of all for opting the EU average, not in meritocratic pursuit, but within a Byzantine world of interest reconciliation, the EU has lost more of its allure as a global leader in integration. If EU citizens switch their role models to the US and Asia, it is just a matter of time before dissatisfaction translates in a legitimate transfer to the better global team, including more exits. It is far better to treat Brexit not as a case of treason and an aberration, but as a badly needed wake-up call.